Hello and welcome to Lesson 5. This is our second and final lesson on the endocrine system. Our last lesson, we really focused in on the pituitary gland and what hormones are. Now we're going to go through the rest of the major glands. So first we're going to hit the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is found at the base of the throat. It's a really large gland consisting of two lobes and connected by what we call the isthmus, and that's the kind of central mass. It's composed of hollow structures called follicles, and those are what actually are going to be creating and releasing the hormones. So the thyroid hormone is often referred to as the body's major metabolic hormone, and you're going to hear it called T4 and T3 thyroxines. You can also hear it commonly called, but basically these two hormones together make up the thyroid hormone. So a lot of these terms are a little bit interchangeable. And what this does is the thyroid hormone is going to control the rate in which your glucose is used and converted to ATP energy. It's also really important for tissue growth and development for the reproductive and nervous systems. But you will hear people often say that they have a thyroid issue. If it's hyper-secreting the thyroid hormone, sometimes they can have trouble gaining weight. And if they are hypo-secreting the thyroid hormone or not secreting enough, they may gain a lot of weight because of that. The other major hormone we're going to talk about released from the thyroid gland is calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to decrease blood calcium levels by causing calcium to be deposited in the bones. So if you remember from the skeletal system, one of the major functions of bone is to store calcium, and calcitonin is the one that's going to deposit these calcium ions onto the bone and store them. It's made by what we call parafollicular cells, which is between the follicles of the thyroid, and it's released directly into your bloodstream if you have increased levels of blood calcium. So if your blood calcium levels are too high, you release calcitonin, and that excess calcium gets stored right on the bones. Okay, so this is just kind of showing you what the thyroid looks like on a microscopic level. So you can see that there's parafollicular cells and follicle cells. So your metabolic hormone, the thyroid hormone, is going to be released from these follicle cells, and then these parafollicular cells are what's going to be releasing the calcitonin. And then these follicles here are where the hormones are being stored. Next, we're going to talk about your parathyroid glands, which are actually on the back of the thyroid gland. And the individuals are different. Most people have 4, 2 on each thyroid lobe, but some people can have up to 8 of these. And the major hormone that is going to be released is called the parathyroid hormone, or PTH. And PTH works antagonistically with calcitonin, so opposite. What it does is if your calcium levels drop, then the parathyroids are going to stimulate your osteoclasts. And once again, going back to our skeletal unit, osteoclasts are going to break down bone matrix. And then in doing this, you're going to be able to release calcium back into your bloodstream. So where calcitonin decreased blood calcium by putting it onto bone, the parathyroid can increase it by breaking down that bone using osteoclasts. This picture in a nutshell kind of demonstrates everything that we've talked about. So if we look here, this is when our blood calcium is at homeostasis and perfect. If it rises too much, then the thyroid gland is going to release calcitonin. Calcitonin deposits the excess calcium onto bone, and that brings us back to homeostasis. If our blood calcium levels fall or drop too much, then these parathyroid glands, which are found on the back of the thyroid, are going to release PTH, or the parathyroid hormone. PTH is going to stimulate osteoclasts to break down bone matrix, which releases calcium into the bloodstream, and then your calcium once again is back into homeostasis. So these two hormones working together ultimately can regulate your blood calcium levels. Next, we're going to be talking about the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands we've already mentioned because we talked about them in the endocrine system, or I'm sorry, in the nervous system. We talked about how they release adrenaline with the sympathetic nervous system. So you have two. You have one on each kidney. And the interesting thing is they're actually kind of two organs in one. And what I mean by this is they have a cortex, which is the outer portion, and that's glandular tissue. But the one that we've already talked about is the medulla. And the medulla is on the inside and made of neural tissue. And that's the portion that's going to be able to release that norepinephrine and epinephrine into the bloodstream. So here is a nice picture of your adrenal glands. Voila. And what I think is really cool about this is we're able to kind of see different layers. So this bottom layer here is the medulla, so that's the neural tissue, your epinephrine, norepinephrine. But then here is all these different layers that show you what kind of hormones are released. So we're going to talk about what a glucocorticoid is, and we're going to talk about what a mineralocorticoid is, but you can see that each kind of layer of this adrenal cortex releases certain hormones. So first, let's go ahead and talk about those corticosteroids. They include three separate groups. Mineralocorticoids is going to be aldosterone. Glucocorticoids are going to be cortisone and cortisol. And then sex hormones are going to be androgens and estrogens. So first, let's go ahead and talk about aldosterone. And this is a pretty complex hormone. It does a lot. The most important things it does is it regulates how much salt is in the blood, so how much sodium is actually in the blood. So when it gets released from the adrenal glands, it actually goes to the kidneys and basically tells the kidneys to either reabsorb or flush salt out depending on how much is actually in the blood. And this actually also helps with water and electrolyte regulation. And the interesting thing is we have other body parts or other organs that actually stimulate the release of aldosterone. For example, renin is an enzyme that's produced by your kidneys. So when your blood pressure drops too much, the kidneys actually signal the release of aldosterone. And what happens is then we actually reabsorb more salt and water back into the blood, and that's going to increase our blood pressure. If our blood pressure is too high, then there's a local hormone called ANP released from your heart, and this inhibits the release of aldosterone, so we're flushing out sodium, and this is going to reduce blood volume and pressure. And this shows all the ways that aldosterone can be stimulated or inhibited. The most obvious one is obviously ACTH released from the pituitary, the adrenal corticotropic hormone. That's going to stimulate the adrenal cortex. But we also can stimulate the release of aldosterone by using renin, which is that one that's released from the kidneys, or we can reduce the release of aldosterone by that ANP released from the heart. Then we have our cortisone and cortisol. And you've probably heard of cortisone before. Cortisol is pretty much the same thing. It helps to control inflammation and reduce swelling. A lot of times when people are having chronic pain in joints, they will often go get a cortisone shot directly into that joint to try to bring down any swelling. So that's where you've probably heard it before. I know we talked about it in our skeletal unit when we talked about rheumatoid arthritis. And once again, this is going to be stimulated by the adrenocorticotropic hormone. Last but not least, we have our sex hormones. They're actually produced in really small amounts in the adrenal glands, so we're not going to get into all the functions of them yet because we're going to hit them when we get to the ovaries and testes. But really just know that androgens released from here are known as your male sex hormones, and estrogens are known as your female sex hormones. Then we have our adrenal medulla. So these are ones that we've already talked about. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are what are going to be released from the adrenal medulla, and collectively they're known as catecholamines. That's a kind of a new term. We haven't used that yet. So we know that these two hormones are released during times of extreme stress. So we have our increase in heart rate, our increase in blood pressure. We want to make sure that we're getting blood flow to our skeletal muscles, heart, lungs, and brain. And something to note here is that the catecholamines are more for short-term stress. Remember, fight or flight. So if we're in danger, if we're in a life-threatening situation, or we're exercising, for 45 minutes, that's going to be short-term stress. Where cortisone and cortisol are going to be more of your long-term stressors. These are the hormones that are going to deal with disorders and diseases that are causing chronic stress on the body. All right, we're going to move on to our pancreas. The pancreas is located close to the stomach, and once we get into the digestive system, you're going to see that it's also what we call an exocrine gland, and it helps with digestion as well. But we're going to focus on the endocrine function of it. This is an extremely important concept for this class. The pancreas and diabetes and knowing insulin and glucagon, the two hormones, is a major topic. So it's very important that you are present during this presentation and making sure that you're fully understanding it. But this is a huge topic for finals. So the two pancreas hormones are going to be insulin and glucagon. So this is your pancreas close-up. It's close to the stomach because it actually does release enzymes into the small intestine during digestion. But when we look at it on a hormone level, what we're looking at are these islets here, which are these masses of tissue. And it's important to note that there are beta cells and there are alpha cells in these pancreatic islets, because those are going to be the two major cells that we talk about when looking at the pancreas. So what we're going to do is we're going to pause here. I want you to kind of review this video and then get ready for how blood sugar levels are maintained by the pancreas.